Hey guys, tonight we drift into a world where gods casually invent humans' headaches, and you, snug under your blanket, get front row seats to the drama. Imagine the sky crackling, Zeus pacing impatiently, gripping his temples as if the weight of Olympus itself pressed down. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but that's the fun part. You can let your eyelids droop while we wade through a tale of divine birth, craft, and strategic genius. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, type your location and local time into the comments. It's oddly satisfying to know someone in, say, Timbuktu, is nodding along to a Greek myth at 10 p.m. their time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into the thunderstorm of myth, where lightning isn't just decorative, it's the breath of Zeus, irritated and omnipotent. From his skull, literally, sprouts Athena, fully grown, armored, and blinking as if she just stepped off a divine assembly line. Imagine that for a second. You're carrying the weight of the world, and someone casually pops out of your head, perfectly coiffed and ready to debate philosophy or teach swordplay. Historians still argue whether this unusual birth symbolized wisdom emerging directly from intellect, or if the storytellers just wanted a convenient, instant adult goddess shortcut, saving time on diaper-changing narratives. You notice she isn't just any newborn. She carries the calm focus of someone who's already read strategy manuals no mortal will ever see. Her eyes, sharp like polished bronze, scan the world and, for some reason, immediately size up mortal affairs. Scholars have whimsically speculated she might have inspired the first chess moves, or at least, the first arguments over whose turn it was, though obviously no chessboards existed yet. Meanwhile, fringe tales hint she may have emerged wearing a full battle helmet, which must have been an early trend in divine fashion, because, let's face it, nothing says, I mean business, like head-to-toe bronze. As you settle in, imagine Zeus's headache not fading. Lightning sizzles across his brow. Even the other gods peek over curiously. Is she fully grown? Someone whispers. Of course she is, Zeus mutters, a little defensively. And there she stands, testing her arms, flexing fingers, and already demonstrating that tacticians can indeed multitask. One hand adjusting a spear, the other plotting city defense. You probably didn't expect this when you picked bedtime stories tonight, but Athena's debut is more like a board meeting in armor than a cradle lullaby. You can almost feel the smell of burning incense drifting from the temples that would later honor her, mingling with the tang of ozone from Zeus's lingering stormy mood. Quirky tidbit. Some fringe traditions claim she hummed a lullaby to the clouds, convincing them to part gently so she could take her first step, though this detail is debated and probably more poetic than historical. Still, it's charming to think the sky itself listened. And here's a little sensory twist. Her first breath carries the scent of olives, not just because of symbolism, but perhaps an early nod to agriculture, which mortals would later worship fervently. You might stretch under your blanket, pretending your fingers brush against the olive groves Athena would later claim, feeling the rough bark, sticky resin, and smooth silver leaves. It's calming and oddly grounding, which is perfect because your eyelids are starting to feel the pull of this sleepy ASMR world. You remember Zeus's headache again, a subtle callback to his first parenting problem. This is a goddess who literally emerges from intellect and pain, ready to teach, fight, and occasionally correct the egos of mortals. Historians still argue whether this birth story reflected a real cultic metaphor or simply delighted oral storytellers aiming to shock and entertain. Either way, the lesson is clear. Wisdom can appear suddenly, fully formed, and leave everyone else scrambling to catch up. In that moment, you sense the blend of awe and absurdity. Lightning in the air, a goddess brushing off her helmet, and the other gods peering like teens at a new kid who just aced every class without studying. Athena's first steps are quiet but decisive. She doesn't crawl, doesn't stumble. She simply surveys Olympus like she owns it, which, honestly, she might as well. This calm, focused aura, paired with a touch of divine sarcasm, sets the tone for the stories you're about to drift through tonight. And as you yawn, the narrative folds over you like a soft blanket. the smell of imagined olive trees lingering, Zeus's lingering headache, fading into the background hum of distant thunder. You're poised between worlds, the mortal, where bedtime stories lull you toward sleep, and the divine, where strategy, craft, and wit shape mountains, cities, and future myths. Athena's story, starting with her miraculous, headache-inducing birth, invites you to float gently into a dreamscape of logic, cleverness, and oddly satisfying power plays. You trudge further into Athena's early exploits, and it's clear that even fully grown at birth, she wasn't content to lounge around Olympus sipping ambrosia. No, she's restless, curious, and already fiddling with the stuff of mortals, clay, reeds, and rudimentary tools that look suspiciously like the precursors to knitting needles or maybe even early surgical instruments. You probably didn't expect a newborn goddess to have hobbies, but here you are, imagining her kneeling by a stream, sculpting tiny animals out of mud, while birds hop nervously nearby, as if aware they're under the critical eye of someone who could invent war and wisdom in a single afternoon. From the start, Athena is fascinated by both creation and control. You watch her tame animals with a patience and intuition that makes you question your own ability to train a goldfish. Fringe myths whisper that she even taught the first domesticated cat to sit on command, though this is probably more poetic than factual. Scholars still argue whether these animal taming stories were originally symbolic, showing her mastery over nature, or literal claims made by early storytellers who clearly had vivid imaginations and an affinity for cute animals. You let your fingers trace imaginary fur along the edges of your blanket as you picture her coaching fledgling owls to swoop in perfect formation. She also starts inventing crafts, and here's where your modern brain perks up. She's not just weaving or potting. She's creating objects that blend utility with aesthetic perfection. Imagine her making the first braided ropes, the earliest pattern cloths, or clever fishing nets, all while the gods peer over her shoulder, some impressed, others slightly jealous. It's oddly relatable. You know that feeling when a kid comes up with a Lego structure you can't figure out? That's Olympus right now, full of immortals muttering under their breaths. How did she even think of that? In one particularly quirky episode, she challenges a mortal artisan to a weaving contest. You probably wouldn't survive this without yawning, but the story is deliciously petty. She wins without breaking a sweat, naturally, and the artisan is left so flustered he accidentally dyes his work purple, which in hindsight is hilarious because purple dye was more expensive than gold. Historians still argue whether this story was meant to elevate Athena's skills or warn mortals about hubris, but either way, you can't help but smile at her combination of competence and divine sass. You notice how she navigates both social and natural landscapes with finesse. Early Olympians often found themselves at odds over petty disagreements, and Athena diffuses these with calm reasoning or, when necessary, a sly prank. You might picture her creating intricate mazes out of reeds just to amuse herself and secretly teach the young god strategy. Fringe stories suggest she even used to rearrange clouds to hide Olympus from prying eyes, probably a metaphor for strategic invisibility, or maybe just playful godly mischief. She is already showing signs of a lifelong pattern, measured, clever, and subtly controlling the flow of events around her. You imagine her walking along the rivers of Olympus, observing mortal life below with binoculars of omniscience. Okay, maybe just divine intuition, noting what crafts they lack, what animals are mismanaged, and mentally cataloging lessons for her future protégés like Perseus and Odysseus. It's mesmerizing in a sleepy way, like watching someone knit a tapestry of time itself, one calculated action at a time. Another historical fact drifts into your thoughts as your eyelids begin to droop. Early Greek culture revered wisdom and skill in craft nearly as much as courage in battle. Athena embodies both, and by combining them at birth, she becomes a template for the ideal citizen goddess, a standard that future Athenians would invoke in politics, architecture, and education. You curl a little deeper under your covers, imagining her tiny hands shaping clay pots that will one day influence Olympic prizes, olive oil containers, and even the first coinage designs. You feel the contrast between her mischievous streak and profound intelligence. Oddly, this is where fringe accounts become almost comforting. They suggest she sometimes played practical jokes on the other gods, like moving their sandals or switching thunderbolts with sticks, just to see if Zeus noticed. Historians still argue whether these playful anecdotes were originally true pranks or narrative devices to humanize her. Either way, it's amusing to picture an all-knowing goddess with a penchant for minor chaos, softly reminding you that even immortals enjoy a little mischief. As you drift further, you sense her early adventures set the tone for the rest of her existence. Strategic, observant, endlessly curious, and inherently clever. Each act, whether it's inventing a tool, taming a beast, or correcting an overconfident mortal, establishes a rhythm that you can almost feel pulsing through the pages of myth, like a slow, hypnotic drumbeat. You imagine the rustle of reeds, the murmur of streams, and the faint echo of immortal footsteps mingling, and your body relaxes into the story. By the time you reach the closing scenes of this early life, Athena has already proven she's not only born to lead but to teach, invent, and entertain herself along the way. Her restless energy feels almost tangible, like a soft breeze brushing your cheek, guiding you to contemplate skill, patience, and curiosity. You yawn and remember that tomorrow, when you wake, you might actually retain a fragment of this divine cleverness, if only subconsciously, tucked under your eyelids like a whispered hint from Olympus itself. You trudge along with Athena as she steps into the world of organized strategy and martial training, and it's clear that even though she emerged fully grown, she doesn't skip her lessons. Picture her in a sun-dappled glade somewhere on Olympus, spear in hand, testing formations with invisible opponents. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but imagine the intensity. Each step measured, each gesture deliberate, her eyes scanning for weaknesses as if the very air around her were a living battlefield. Historians still argue whether the Greeks intended her martial training to be symbolic, representing strategic thinking, or a literal depiction of combat prowess. But either way, it's mesmerizing to imagine. She studies alongside other immortals, and occasionally a mortal she deems worthy, demonstrating the early roots of tactical instruction. Fringe traditions suggest she invented the first battle drills by marking lines in the earth with her spear, and then running formations herself, while humming a tune that mortals would later interpret as the first war chant. You can hear it softly in your mind, a rhythmic cadence that aligns strangely with your heartbeat as you sink deeper into your blanket. Athena's training isn't just brute force, it's intellectual. She sketches maps in the dirt, anticipates enemy movements, and even plays miniature war games with pebbles and sticks. You might imagine a tiny figurine of a lion, a deer, and a chariot placed precisely to test different maneuvers, and as she nudges the pieces into position, you feel the same gentle tension you get while playing a board game with friends, except the stakes are divine. Oddly enough, some fringe myths claim she occasionally used small owls as scouts during practice, which would make sense given her later symbolic association with a bird. You probably wouldn't want to spar with her. Athena's not just quick, she's predictive. She anticipates your moves before you make them, a skill that mortals would later revere as uncanny wisdom. Scholars still argue whether this foresight is meant as a literal ability or as metaphorical encouragement for thinking ahead in war. Either way, you can imagine her tiptoeing around an invisible enemy, circling like a cat stalking prey, perfectly balanced between patience and explosive energy. Her influence starts to ripple beyond the training grounds. She introduces new techniques, formations that reduce casualties, signals that enhance communication, and strategies for defending city walls. You probably didn't realize how much military wisdom is wrapped up in bedtime stories, but the smell of bronze weapons, the soft scrape of sand underfoot, and the distant whistle of an arrow conjure a surprisingly vivid scene. Fringe scholars even speculate she may have inspired early Athenian military manuals, though there's debate about whether such texts existed or were retroactively attributed to her cleverness. Even in practice, her sense of fairness shines. She emphasizes discipline and skill over sheer strength, correcting mistakes with gentle nudges or a soft laugh rather than harsh reprimands. You can picture the other gods, a bit sulky, mimicking her movements, while she subtly reshapes their behavior with a wink and a deft parry. It's a balance of power and pedagogy. teaching that the sharpest mind often prevails over the strongest arm. Athena also experiments with innovative weapons. Fringe stories describe her testing the first tactical javelins and experimenting with detachable shields, a precursor, perhaps, to the flexible strategies mortals would later adopt in battle. You can almost smell the tang of metal and waxed leather, and imagine her adjusting a small shield, tilting it to reflect sunlight in just the right angle, blending practicality with elegance. Scholars still argue whether these details were literal inventions or allegorical representations of her strategic brilliance, but the image is hypnotic and oddly comforting as your eyelids droop further. Her lessons extend to alliances, too. She encourages coordination rather than conflict, showing that teamwork often beats brute force. You picture tiny Olympian skirmishes, her orchestrating movements with subtle gestures, teaching the gods that communication can shape outcomes even more effectively than raw power. This balance between intellect and might becomes the signature of her later life, and you feel it resonating in your imagination as a gentle rhythm, guiding you toward sleep. By the time you're fully immersed, Athena has transformed the concept of martial training itself. She demonstrates that battle isn't just physical but mental, social, and strategic. You might imagine a slow fade out, sun lowering behind the mountains, her shadow stretching across the training grounds, a soft breeze rustling the leaves, and the faint metallic ring of her weapons settling into quiet. Fringe myths suggest that even in these quiet moments, she might have been practicing mental puzzles or early versions of chess, further intertwining war and wisdom in her every move. And as your own body relaxes alongside her measured footsteps, you realize that Athena's early training is more than skill building. It's a lesson in patience, foresight, and balance. The tactile sense of spears, shields, and polished bronze lingers in your mind like a soothing echo, guiding you toward a calm, methodical pace. Her strategic mind hums softly in your imagination, setting a gentle cadence for the stories yet to unfold. You drift, fully aware that the goddess of war and wisdom has already begun shaping not only her world but your slow, dreamlike journey through it. You trudge now into one of the more oddly calming chapters of Athena's story, where she trades spears for olive branches and a subtle rivalry with Poseidon turns into one of the earliest instances of civic PR. Imagine the dusty plains near Athens, a patch of earth so bare it makes your eyes water, and Athena kneeling with her hands deep in the soil, thinking, "How can I make this city worth worshipping?" You probably won't survive this fully awake, but picture it. Her hair glinting in the sun, her armored sandals kicking up fine dirt, as she contemplates the gift that will define her patronage. The olive tree is born from this quiet calculation. Athena plants it not just as a source of food, but as a symbol of peace, prosperity, and cunning. A green reminder that intelligence and patience trump brute force. Fringe myths even suggest that the first olives tasted faintly of ambrosia, which would have made them irresistible to both mortals and minor deities, though scholars still argue whether such details were original or later embellishments by storytellers seeking to make the tale more magical. You imagine the soft, leathery leaves brushing your fingers as if you're standing there beside her, inhaling the earthy aroma of newly turned soil. Poseidon, of course, isn't exactly thrilled. You remember his trident's restless tapping on the rocky shore, stirring small waves and sending seagulls into panicked flight. The saltwater god had offered a horse, a showy, flashy gift for Athens, but Athena's steady, modest olive tree wins the city's favor. Scholars still debate whether this story reflects historical religious politics, like actual competition between cults, or if it's simply a metaphor for practical versus ostentatious contributions. Either way, it's oddly satisfying to imagine a subtle PR battle over a city that's only just emerging from mythic fog. Athena tends to the olive tree with meticulous care, inspecting the leaves, adjusting irrigation, divine irrigation, more like a gentle rain summoned with thought than a bucket, and whispering encouragement. Fringe accounts say she occasionally sang to the tree, a soft hum that encouraged growth, and while historians scoff at literal interpretations, it's poetic enough to make you sigh contentedly under your blanket. The olive becomes a cornerstone of Athenian identity, and you might picture the first harvest, tiny, green, imperfect olives, glistening in the sunlight, waiting to be crushed into oil, pressed into meals, or sold in bustling marketplaces. You also notice a minor, amusing mishap, a wandering goat, sent by Hermes for reasons no one remembers, munches a few branches. Athena simply sighs and replants them, a gentle reminder that patience is a goddess's best tool. You probably wouldn't survive the frustration of that many minor setbacks, but Athena handles them effortlessly, her calm presence radiating over the plains, the olive's leaves trembling slightly as if acknowledging their divine caretaker. As the city begins to gather around this green gift, the people of Athens slowly realize the tree is more than food. It represents wisdom, strategy, and resilience. Fringe scholars have suggested that early olive oil production may have been linked to religious ceremonies honoring Athena, though historians still argue whether these were primarily economic, spiritual, or a blend of both. You might imagine yourself wandering a rustic Athenian village, inhaling the sharp, fruity scent of oil pressed fresh from olives, feeling the soft hum of divine oversight in the air. Athena's calm cleverness extends to how she teaches mortals through the tree. She introduces pruning, planting, and selective harvest, subtle lessons in patience and foresight that echo her own disciplined nature. You probably won't survive absorbing all the nuances of ancient horticulture without nodding off, but the story has a soft, lulling rhythm. Hands in soil, leaves rustling, distant waves, birds chirping, all blending into a sensory tapestry that quiets the mind. And there's a little wink of her humor, too. Fringe myths whisper that she sometimes painted tiny patterns on the leaves to amuse herself and the occasional mortal observer, a gentle reminder that even wisdom enjoys a playful twist. Scholars still argue whether such tales are metaphorical or literal, but the image lingers, soothing and oddly charming as your body begins to melt into your pillow. By the time you drift toward the end of this section, Athena has solidified her role not just as a warrior and strategist, but as a nurturer, a planner, and a subtle influencer over the lives of mortals. You might visualize a soft sunset over the olive groves, a gentle breeze rustling leaves, and Athena's calm, watchful gaze over the city she's quietly shaping. The story moves slowly, like the growth of the olive itself, drawing you deeper into this sleepy, thoughtful narrative. You trudge now into Athena's expanding role as a protector and patron of cities, and it's oddly comforting to imagine her striding down cobblestone streets that don't yet exist, cloak fluttering softly, eye scanning every corner for potential chaos or inspiration. You probably won't survive thinking about this fully awake, but picture it. Her shadow stretching over nascent temples, the scent of fresh stone and clay wafting up as artisans carve symbols in her honor. Historians still argue whether her worship extended beyond Athens in any meaningful political sense, but the stories insist she's the city guardian, quietly influencing everything from street layout to civic decorum. Athena's presence feels less like a parade and more like a gentle, organizing hand. Fringe accounts claim she sometimes walked the streets at night, adjusting lamps or repositioning benches to improve traffic flow, though scholars still debate whether these anecdotes are literal or metaphorical for her guiding the civic mind. You imagine leaning against a column, inhaling the faint metallic tang of chisels and the soft dust of freshly hewn stone, sensing her quiet vigilance everywhere. Her protection extends beyond infrastructure. You see her advising councils, whispering into the ears of leaders who are just barely awake enough to take note. The advice ranges from battle strategies to civic improvements, from market fairness to irrigation innovations. You probably wouldn't survive all the administrative minutiae, but Athena makes it seem effortless, balancing intellect, foresight, and the occasional gentle sarcasm that reminds mortals their cleverness pales beside hers. Fringe tales even suggest she once mediated a dispute over olive grove ownership by drawing an elaborate diagram in the dirt, which resolved the conflict without a single raised voice. A kind of early urban planning meets diplomacy. She also inspires the creation of early civic rituals, including festivals and sacrifices that mortals would later codify. You can almost smell the incense and hear the murmur of chanting citizens, imagining Athena standing just outside the temple doors, approving or subtly tweaking each ceremony with a thoughtful nod. Scholars still argue whether these practices originated organically from her cult or were retroactively attributed to her divine influence, but the detail doesn't disrupt your drowsy absorption of the narrative. It's soft, rhythmic, and oddly grounding. Her reputation spreads through tales and whispered rumors. Athena watches over the city, offering guidance to those who seek it, sometimes offering subtle corrections or strategic nudges. You might picture her perched atop a marble column at dusk, surveying the streets, the faint breeze carrying the smell of baked bread, olive oil, and the occasional whiff of horse sweat from training grounds. Fringe myths suggest she even leaves small, symbolic gifts at doorsteps, tiny charms of olive branches or feathers, though historians debate whether these were actual practices or poetic flourishes in storytelling. You notice a playful side of her civic guidance. Fringe accounts say she occasionally rearranged market stalls or nudged public fountains to correct minor inefficiencies or to amuse herself, blending oversight with gentle humor. You probably won't survive analyzing each tiny intervention fully, but it's a reminder that even citywide influence can carry a whisper of playfulness, softening the weight of omnipotence into something human-adjacent. Athena's protection isn't only about guidance, it's about embodiment. Citizens begin to invoke her wisdom in everyday choices, from choosing the best olive oil to settling disputes between neighbors. You can feel her presence in the mundane, a comforting shadow that guides subtle decisions. Scholars still debate whether these domestic invocations were widespread or primarily symbolic, but the image, the scent of pressed olives, the quiet hum of a city under her watchful eye, folds neatly into your imagination, easing you further towards sleep. As the city grows, Athena balances her roles delicately: guardian, teacher, tactician, and occasionally prankster. You might picture her adjusting the alignment of a newly built wall or reminding a young architect to account for sunlight angles. Fringe tales suggest she whispered hints of innovation into dreams of mortal inventors, nudging them toward olive presses, fortifications, or weaving techniques that will carry her influence into practical life. You feel the calm pulse of this guidance, a soft lull like the rhythm of a city breathing under a patient, invisible hand. By the time this section concludes, Athena has established herself as more than a deity of wisdom or war. She is a subtle director of civic life, shaping Athens and its citizens with an almost imperceptible yet firm touch. You might visualize the city from above, sun glinting on rooftops, olive groves swaying in gentle wind, and Athena's calm figure overlooking it all. Her presence is both protective and inspiring, a steady heartbeat beneath the bustle of human activity, drawing your mind toward a slow, serene state, perfectly attuned for the story still unfolding. You trudge now into Athena's fascination with weaving and crafts, and it's surprisingly soothing to picture her in a quiet room, sunlight filtering through a high window, hands moving deftly over loom and thread. You probably won't survive the level of detail fully awake, but imagine the rhythmic clack of shuttle and loom, the scent of dyed fibers mingling with faint olive oil from nearby groves. Historians still argue whether these tales of her weaving prowess were literal claims or allegories for skill and intellect, but either way, it's mesmerizing to picture her absorbed in intricate patterns that could hypnotize even the most restless mortal mind. She doesn't just weave for beauty, she weaves lessons. Fringe accounts suggest her tapestries depict subtle stories of strategy, morality, and cosmic order, almost like coded messages for observant mortals. You might imagine tracing the threads with your fingers, following tiny embroidered warriors, ships, and olive trees, each stitch carrying wisdom that's both subtle and profound. Scholars still debate whether the mythological weaving stories were designed as instructional metaphors or simply to glorify her skill, but the effect is calming, like watching someone perform a practiced, elegant dance. One legendary contest exemplifies her meticulous approach. She challenges a mortal woman, Arachne, whose hubris rivals the gods. You see Athena's calm intensity, correcting mistakes with a gentle nod, her own tapestry flawless and detailed. Fringe tales even claim she added a small owl hidden in the weave, a cheeky signature only perceptive viewers would notice. You probably wouldn't survive mentally cataloging each design fully awake, but you feel the lulling rhythm of the shuttle, the repetitive motion creating a gentle trance. Her influence on crafts extends beyond textiles. Athena experiments with pottery, carving, and metalwork, quietly showing mortals the potential of blending practicality with artistry. You imagine a small bronze statuette glinting in the sun, or a clay vessel painted with olive motifs, each one infused with lessons on balance and precision. Scholars still argue whether these accounts reflect historical inspiration or retroactive attribution, but the tactile imagery is undeniably soothing. There's also an almost playful obsession with perfection. Fringe accounts suggest she occasionally sabotaged her own work slightly to test apprentices' attention, or to amuse herself, hiding a subtle mistake that only the most observant would notice. You probably won't survive analyzing her subtle pranks without drifting off, but it's oddly comforting to see a goddess who balances skill with humor, teaching diligence without harshness. Athena's weaving sometimes intersects with her strategic mind. Imagine her creating tapestries that double as battle diagrams, each thread representing troop movements or city defenses. Fringe myths hint she occasionally gifted such works to heroes and rulers, who would later claim divine insight in interpreting them. Historians still argue whether these stories were primarily symbolic or reflective of actual ritual practices, but either way, it's a testament to her integrated intellect, blending craft, strategy, and subtle pedagogy. As you drift deeper into the narrative, you sense the soothing cadence of her work. The loom becomes a metaphorical heartbeat, steady, rhythmic, and purposeful. You might picture threads of gold and silver glinting in the sun, woven into complex patterns, a tangible expression of intelligence and patience. Fringe myths suggest that observing her weaving could induce calm and focus even in mortals, a divine ASMR, if you will, and the idea is oddly comforting as your eyelids grow heavier. Athena's crafts are more than decoration. They're lessons, strategies, and gentle interventions in mortal life. She blends beauty with function, intellect with patience, humor with instruction. Scholars still debate whether weaving was her primary symbol of wisdom or one of many overlapping attributes. But for you, snug in your blankets, the image is hypnotic. Sunlight, loom, shuttle, and a goddess quietly shaping minds with threads. By the end of this section, you feel the pulse of her methodical creativity, a rhythm that mirrors your own slow breathing, coaxing you further toward rest. The tactile imagery, the gentle clatter of loom, and the soft gleam of thread under sunbeam all work in tandem to lull you into a calm, reflective state, perfectly suited for the stories still waiting to unfold. You trudge now into Athena's tangled web of friendships and rivalries, and it's oddly satisfying to imagine her standing in a sunlit hall of Olympus, one eyebrow arched, arms crossed, while the other gods shift nervously around her. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but picture it. Her gaze sweeping past Poseidon, Ares, and a few minor divinities, measuring ambition, ego, and raw energy like a chess player studying pieces on a board. Historians still argue whether these divine rivalries reflected actual cultic conflicts or were simply narrative devices to make stories more dramatic. But either way, they're mesmerizing in their subtlety. Poseidon is the obvious thorn in her side. Fringe tales suggest that when he offered horses to Athens, Athena countered with the olive tree, setting up a rivalry that became a long-running game of one-upmanship. You imagine him sulking, trident tapping the ocean waves, while Athena, calm as a morning breeze, tweaks details in her olive groves just to remind him she's ahead. Scholars still debate whether these contests symbolized control over cities or reflected deeper societal tensions between maritime and agrarian cultures. But the scene is vivid in its playful tension. Ares, the god of brute war, is another source of friction. Athena, trained in strategy and disciplined combat, can outmaneuver his chaotic attacks effortlessly. Fringe accounts describe little skirmishes, where she rearranges battlefield layouts or hides his weapons temporarily, a subtle assertion of cleverness over raw aggression. You probably wouldn't survive the mental math required to predict each move, but it's oddly soothing to see brains consistently winning over brawn. Scholars still argue whether these interactions were meant to instruct mortals on strategy or simply entertain them with divine soap opera. Friendships are more delicate. Athena forms alliances with gods like Hermes and Hephaestus, quietly sharing insights, hints, and occasionally minor divine inventions. You can picture them huddled over glowing tools or maps, whispering tactics, sharing a soft chuckle while the rest of Olympus grumbles or gawks. Fringe myths suggest that these collaborations sometimes involve playful wagers or minor pranks to keep creativity high, a pattern that will repeat throughout Athena's life. Athena also navigates relationships with mortals cautiously. You imagine her appearing to a hero in a dream, offering advice without revealing herself fully, or leaving subtle clues in crafts, architecture, or even the behavior of animals. Scholars still debate whether these interventions were metaphorical encouragements for mortal ingenuity or literal divine interference, but the effect is the same. She becomes a subtle influencer, shaping outcomes without overwhelming them. In quieter moments, you notice her sense of humor. Fringe accounts suggest that she sometimes exaggerates rivalries or pranks her divine friends to test their reactions, a kind of celestial social experiment. You probably won't survive cataloging each small trick, but imagining Zeus tripping over his own toga while Athena snickers behind a column is oddly comforting and lulls your mind gently towards sleep. Her relationships highlight a consistent principle. Wisdom is as much about understanding others as mastering skill. You can picture her calmly mediating disputes, nudging both gods and mortals toward better outcomes, or simply demonstrating her superiority through subtle, clever maneuvers that leave everyone else flustered but unharmed. Scholars still argue whether these stories reflect societal ideals for behavior or simply entertaining moral fables, but either interpretation hums gently in your imagination. By the time you drift deeper, you sense that Athena's rivalries and friendships are not just drama. They are lessons in balance, tact, and observation. Each interaction is a ripple, subtly altering the divine and mortal spheres. You might visualize her standing atop a temple, watching sun glint off olive trees and marble statues, a faint smile playing across her lips, orchestrating the dance of personalities around her. It's a calm, deliberate rhythm, the gentle push and pull of intellect, humor, and strategy, perfectly suited to easing your mind toward dreamlike stillness. And as you settle further, the stories of minor squabbles, whispered alliances, and strategic pranks wrap around you like a soft blanket, reminding you that even gods navigate relationships, and the cleverness of Athena, observant, patient, and mischievous, is a model for gentle vigilance, quiet influence, and the soft pulse of thoughtful action. You trudge now into the morally tangled tale of Medusa and the Gorgons, and it's oddly mesmerizing to picture Athena, standing at a distance, arms folded, observing a situation that mortals would later call tragic. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but imagine her calm, calculating presence contrasted with the chaos swirling around a cursed maiden, snakes writhing in place of hair, eyes glowing with unintended power. Historians still argue whether Athena's role here represents divine justice, moral instruction, or a narrative convenience to demonstrate the consequences of hubris. Medusa's transformation into a Gorgon is, by fringe accounts, a complicated blend of curse and protection. Some myths suggest Athena intervened not out of malice, but to shield Medusa from further harm, though it came at a price. You can almost feel the tension in the air, the faint hiss of serpents, the cool dampness of a cave, and Athena's quiet sigh as she balances justice, foresight, and strategic containment. Scholars still debate whether Athena's involvement was direct or simply a story later appended to elevate her wisdom and authority. You notice Athena's characteristic mix of subtlety and strategy. Fringe stories claim she provided Perseus with a reflective shield and other tools to deal with Medusa, emphasizing cleverness over brute strength. You probably wouldn't survive imagining the precise geometry of using a mirrored shield to navigate a battlefield of petrifying gaze. But it's hypnotic as you picture Perseus tiptoeing through shadows, shield raised, guided indirectly by Athena's intelligence. Her involvement in Medusa's story is morally ambiguous. Some interpretations frame it as punitive, others as protective, highlighting Athena's tendency to operate in shades of gray rather than black and white judgments. You might imagine her observing from the cliffs, the wind tugging at her cloak, considering consequences, weighing lessons for mortals, and quietly reminding you that wisdom often involves difficult choices. Fringe accounts even suggest she rearranged nearby terrain to create natural barriers, a subtle form of intervention that shows foresight in unexpected ways. Athena's strategic mind shines again in her indirect mentorship. You picture her whispering advice to heroes and mortals through dreams, reflections, or cryptic signs. Historians still argue whether these indirect influences were primarily symbolic or literal in ancient stories, but either interpretation emphasizes her preference for teaching cleverness rather than brute force. You feel the quiet rhythm of this subtle guidance, a soft, invisible hand shaping outcomes without imposing overt power. Even in the tale's darker elements, there's an undercurrent of poetic justice. Fringe myths suggest Medusa's gaze, while deadly, also served as a protective deterrent for the innocent and helpless. Athena, in her role, balances morality and pragmatism, offering both tools and consequences, nudging mortals toward clever solutions while preserving order. You probably won't survive parsing the moral nuances fully awake, but imagining the interplay of power, caution, and subtle guidance is curiously soothing. The setting itself adds to the sensory immersion. A damp cave, the scent of wet stone and moss, the hiss of snakes, and the distant echo of Athena's calm footsteps. You picture her figure, serene and composed, a counterpoint to chaos, quietly overseeing a system of cause and effect she understands better than anyone else. Scholars still debate the extent of her responsibility versus Medusa's agency, but the story lulls you with its intricate balance of danger, strategy, and quiet wisdom. By the end of this section, you sense that Athena's involvement isn't simply punitive or protective. It's strategic, instructional, and, in a way, deeply human. You imagine her stepping back, cloak fluttering, olive-scented wind brushing against the cave entrance, as Medusa's fate unfolds. The slow cadence of her actions, measured and deliberate, merges with the soft rhythm of your own breathing, drawing you closer to a dreamlike state where cleverness, caution, and subtle morality weave together seamlessly. You trudge now into Athena's role as the guiding hand behind heroes, and it's oddly comforting to picture her perched on a cliff, cloak shifting in the wind, eyes scanning the paths of mortals who are just barely awake to their destinies. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but imagine her orchestrating the fates of Perseus, Odysseus, and others with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony of cleverness. Historians still argue whether Athena's guidance reflects religious devotion, literary convenience, or a symbolic endorsement of intelligence over brute strength. First, you notice Perseus, timid yet determined, approaching the labyrinthine challenges of slaying Medusa. Fringe tales suggest Athena sent him subtle signs, like the glint of a shield catching moonlight, or the whispered rustle of leaves guiding him to safe paths. You can feel the tension in the air, the damp scent of cave stone, and the distant hiss of serpents, while Athena's calm presence radiates reassurance, like a soft pulse beneath your own heartbeat. Scholars still debate whether her gifts, mirror shields, winged sandals, or sword, were originally narrative inventions or rooted in ritualistic symbolism. Next is Odysseus, weaving through the chaos of war and wandering seas. Athena doesn't simply intervene. She nudges, advises, and tests him, challenging both patience and ingenuity. You probably wouldn't survive imagining all the layers of strategy at once, but it's hypnotic to picture Athena whispering cryptic hints in dreams, arranging minor coincidences, or subtly influencing the perceptions of allies and enemies alike. Fringe stories claim she sometimes disguised herself as mentors, friends, or even random strangers, a divine form of coaching that blends cunning with encouragement. Her influence often involves clever tools or ideas. You might picture magical sandals that allow quiet approach, a reflective shield to avoid direct danger, or a clever ruse woven into battle plans. Historians still argue whether these items were narrative metaphors for intellect and preparation, or imagined literal objects. But either way, the sensory image is vivid: polished bronze, leather straps, and faint gleams of moonlight glinting off enchanted surfaces. Athena's mentorship is not without subtle humor. Fringe accounts suggest she occasionally lets heroes flounder briefly, just to ensure they learn the importance of observation and adaptability. You can almost hear her soft chuckle as Perseus fumbles, with Medusa's severed head, or as Odysseus hesitates before trusting a disguised goddess. You probably wouldn't survive cataloging the lessons embedded in each minor mistake, but the rhythm of trial and guidance has a calming, almost lullaby-like quality as you imagine it unfolding. Even minor heroes benefit from her presence. You picture Athena leaving subtle hints in landscapes, an oddly placed rock, a pattern in the clouds, or a glimmer in a pool of water, each one nudging the clever toward solutions they might otherwise miss. Scholars still debate whether these interventions reflect religious didacticism or literary embellishment, but the effect is the same: a sense of order, foresight, and gentle guidance suffusing the environment. You notice a sensory layer in all this: the soft clang of armor, the rustle of olive groves, the faint tang of salt from nearby seas, and Athena's quiet composure acting like a metronome across the chaos. Fringe tales claim that mere observation of her strategies can sharpen mortal minds, a divine ASMR of sorts, which is strangely comforting as your eyelids grow heavier. By the end of this section, Athena has established herself as more than a distant goddess. She is a tactile, active mentor whose presence transforms peril into learning, danger into opportunity. You might visualize her standing atop a high cliff, surveying a battlefield or a wandering hero, cloak fluttering, the faint scent of olives in the breeze, a soft, omniscient rhythm guiding every decision. The gentle cadence of her interventions, combined with your own slowing heartbeat, nudges you deeper into a meditative, dreamlike state, perfectly poised for the next chapter of strategy, wisdom, and subtle amusement. You trudge now into the famed contest of naming Athens, and it's oddly amusing to picture Athena and Poseidon standing over a patch of dusty ground, both trying to win favor with mortals who are entirely too polite to interrupt a divine argument. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but imagine the tension: Poseidon pounding his trident, water splashing in dramatic arcs, while Athena calmly plants an olive tree and tilts her head, as if saying, "Try topping that." Historians still argue whether this story reflects actual civic myth-making or a symbolic allegory for competing powers in ancient Greek city-states. Poseidon, ever dramatic, offers a horse, a majestic, prancing creature meant to impress. Fringe accounts suggest he even summoned a minor tidal wave for extra flair, which mortals surely appreciated, though perhaps more for the spectacle than the strategic benefit. Athena, unflappable, counters with her olive tree, humble yet practical, embodying sustenance, peace, and long-term prosperity. Scholars debate whether this narrative was meant to teach practical wisdom over ostentation or simply entertain, but the story's rhythm is hypnotic, like a slow tide rolling over sun-warmed stones. The ceremony itself is fascinating. You can imagine citizens of early Athens gathering around, their senses filled with the scent of wet earth, fresh leaves, and salty air from Poseidon's showmanship. Fringe myths suggest they whispered among themselves, trying to interpret which gift carried true divine favor, a precursor to civic debates about leadership and policy. You probably wouldn't survive analyzing every subtle political message, but imagining their small gestures and murmurs is oddly calming, like observing a quiet theater rehearsal. Athena's strategic brilliance shines through subtlety. She doesn't need grand displays. The olive tree, slowly growing, promises sustenance, trade, and fuel for future ceremonies. Fringe accounts even hint that she chose the tree's exact location to maximize sun exposure and rainfall, though scholars still debate whether these details are metaphorical or intended as literal horticultural instruction. The tactile image, the feel of leaves brushing your fingers, the soft soil underfoot, is soothing, a gentle hum for your mind. You notice Poseidon's frustration, a dramatic counterpoint to Athena's calm. Fringe tales claim he stomped a small pool into a swirl of whirlpools, only for the waves to calm as Athena's olive leaves swayed. Scholars still argue whether this dynamic reflects political commentary or narrative flair, but it's entertaining to picture a minor god outmaneuvered with a quiet, clever gesture. You probably wouldn't survive trying to measure each ripple's symbolic meaning, but the ebb and flow has a soft, rhythmic effect on your imagination. Athena's gift resonates with more than practicality. She subtly teaches mortals lessons about foresight, patience, and the value of sustainable growth over flash. You can picture her walking slowly among early Athenians, hands brushing the tree, eyes twinkling as children and elders alike admire its simple elegance. Fringe accounts even suggest she whispered hints of agricultural techniques into dreams, nudging humans toward clever solutions without forcing her hand. Historians still argue whether these divine nudges were part of ritual practice or literary embellishment, but the imagery is soothing as your own breath slows. By the end of this contest, Athena has secured her place not just as the city's patron, but as an embodiment of intelligence, patience, and quiet influence. You might visualize the olive tree standing alone against Poseidon's foaming wave, leaves glinting in the sun, a soft breeze stirring them, and Athena's calm figure watching from a nearby hill. The rhythm of wind, water, and foliage creates a gentle, meditative cadence, pulling you deeper into the dreamlike flow of her story. And as you drift, you sense that the moral isn't just about winning a contest. It's about subtlety, wisdom, and the long-term benefits of careful thought. The story wraps around you like the branches of her olive tree, steadying your mind, softening your thoughts, and preparing you for the next chapter, where cleverness and athletic inspiration quietly shape the world beneath Athena's watchful eye. You trudge now into Athena's involvement in warfare, and it's oddly hypnotic to picture her observing battlefields from high cliffs, cloak fluttering, eyes scanning for patterns in chaos. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but imagine the faint tang of metal in the air, the distant clash of bronze and shield, and her calm presence almost bending time as strategies unfold beneath her gaze. Historians still argue whether myths of her martial guidance reflect actual Athenian military practice or are symbolic narratives promoting intellect over brute force. Athena's interventions are subtle but decisive. Fringe tales suggest she whispers hints through dreams, rustling the leaves to indicate the safest path, or shifting clouds to distract enemy scouts. You can almost feel the soft pressure of her presence, the whisper of wind through olive trees, and the faint echo of orders transmitted invisibly to attentive generals. Scholars still debate whether these stories were literal divine action or allegorical guidance, meant to encourage clever thinking among mortals. She also favors tactical ingenuity over raw aggression. You might picture her plotting formations with pebbles and sticks before a battle, nudging leaders to position archers on high ground or secure water supplies first. Fringe myths even claim she occasionally disguised herself as a mortal advisor to provide guidance directly, blending mentorship with battlefield stealth. You probably wouldn't survive tracing each tactical nuance fully awake, but the cadence of strategy, the push and pull of action and counteraction, is oddly lulling, like listening to a rhythmic drum in the distance. Athena's approach blends preparation, observation, and morality. You notice her correcting reckless maneuvers with subtle signals, a flick of the cloak, a glint of sunlight, or the placement of an olive branch as a marker. Historians still argue whether these acts were symbolic gestures for stories or reflections of ritualized guidance in war planning, but the imagery is calming, precise, deliberate, and methodical. Even the smallest details matter. Fringe accounts suggest she sometimes influences the terrain subtly, eroding a small hill to create a better vantage point or nudging a river to flood a narrow pass. Though scholars debate whether these are poetic flourishes or metaphorical illustrations of strategic foresight. You probably wouldn't survive considering every micro-adjustment, but imagining the landscape bending gently to Athena's insight is hypnotic, like a soft, unseen hand shaping a scene just for your eyes. Her influence is also protective. You picture her shielding soldiers with clever maneuvers, guiding heroes to avoid fatal mistakes, or inspiring them to exploit their opponent's overconfidence. Fringe tales claim she sometimes placed symbolic marks on shields to boost courage or misdirect enemies. Historians still argue about the literal versus symbolic meaning of these embellishments, but the narrative cadence is serene, the rhythm of preparation and execution calming your mind. Athena's strategy extends to diplomacy and war. You might imagine her adjusting alliances, redirecting rivalries, and nudging conversations between generals to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. You probably won't survive cataloging all the social nuances, but the scene, the soft murmur of councils, distant footsteps of soldiers, and Athena's calm, silent orchestration creates a soothing pattern, blending intellect, tact, and quiet humor. By the end of this section, Athena emerges not only as a strategist, but as a moral guide on the battlefield, blending foresight, protection, and cleverness. You might visualize her figure atop a cliff, olive-scented wind brushing your skin, the faint shimmer of sun off armor, every movement measured, intentional, and almost meditative. The rhythm of strategy, observation, and gentle intervention hums in your imagination, drawing you deeper into a tranquil, reflective state, ready to follow her into the next chapter of myths, guidance, and quiet influence over mortals and heroes alike. You trudge now into Athena's role as a teacher of heroes, and it's oddly mesmerizing to picture her moving through a sunlit courtyard where young mortals, heroes in training, struggle with early lessons of courage, cleverness, and perseverance. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but imagine her tall, armored figure gliding between novices, a gentle yet firm hand adjusting their stances, their posture, their mindset. Historians still argue whether these training sessions were purely narrative constructs or reflections of actual cultic pedagogical rituals inspired by her worship. Her guidance is never heavy-handed. Fringe tales suggest she sometimes leaves subtle hints in the environment, an oddly shaped stone pointing toward a hidden passage, a glimmer on a river indicating the safe crossing. You can almost feel the tactile world she manipulates, the smooth stone of a courtyard, the rough bark of nearby olive trees, the soft rustle of grass underfoot, all interacting with her silent instruction. Scholars still debate whether these gestures were intended as literal divine interventions or as metaphorical encouragement for ingenuity and observation. Consider her work with Perseus again, a classic case study. Athena teaches him to rely on reflection rather than confrontation, to think before acting, and to respect the unpredictability of fate. Fringe accounts embellish these lessons with tiny symbolic gifts, a carefully polished shield, a whispered phrase in a dream, or a fleeting shadow guiding the hero toward the right decision. You probably wouldn't survive calculating the full geometry of mirrored light and shadow that saved Perseus from Medusa, but the story flows smoothly, rhythmically, as your eyelids begin to sag. Athena also emphasizes mental agility. You might picture her posing riddles, puzzles, and strategic games, gently teasing mortals to develop quick thinking under pressure. Fringe myths suggest she sometimes rearranges training obstacles overnight, leaving the young heroes to adapt without her intervention, a subtle test of problem-solving. Scholars still argue whether these tales are literal accounts of hero cult practices or narrative devices to glorify her intellect. But imagining the scene, soft sunlight, tactile tools, the faint smell of olive oil from her presence is oddly soporific. Her mentorship blends toughness with patience. Athena corrects errors with a light touch or a sly smile rather than frustration, cultivating resilience and self-reliance. You can almost hear the soft clatter of training weapons, the hum of early morning wind, and her calm, encouraging voice echoing through the courtyard. Fringe stories suggest that observing her work, even as a mortal bystander, imparts subtle knowledge, a divine ASMR of sorts, calming and instructive simultaneously. Athena's teaching also incorporates improvisation. She encourages heroes to think creatively, whether in combat, navigation, or civic decision-making. You probably won't survive cataloging every lesson fully awake, but the narrative gently leads you through a pattern. Observe, plan, act, reflect, a cycle mirrored in both hero development and your own slow descent toward sleep. Scholars still debate whether these training narratives originated as literal instruction or symbolic encouragement, but the effect is hypnotic, rhythmic, and comforting. Even the mundane is instructive under her watch. Fringe accounts say she points out subtleties in nature, the direction of the wind, the slope of a hill, the sound of water over stone, using these cues to teach patience, awareness, and timing. You can imagine running your fingers along rough stone or listening to a distant stream, as if Athena herself guides you through observation. Historians still argue whether this level of environmental tutelage was part of formal cult practices or just a narrative flourish. But either way, it blends seamlessly into your own sleepy imagination. By the end of this section, Athena has cemented herself not merely as a protector of cities or a strategist of battles, but as a calm, measured mentor, blending intellect, patience, and subtle humor into every interaction. You might visualize her figure in the courtyard at dusk, sunlight glinting off bronze armor, soft olive-scented wind brushing against your skin. Each lesson a ripple of quiet influence. The slow, rhythmic cadence of her teaching is nearly hypnotic, guiding your mind gently toward a meditative state, perfectly suited for the next chapter of cleverness, craft, and subtle divine intervention. You trudge now into Athena's role as the divine architect and city planner, and it's oddly soothing to imagine her walking through the empty streets of early Athens, measuring angles, tapping stones, and envisioning a city that doesn't quite exist yet. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but picture the soft sunlight bouncing off white marble, the faint scent of wet clay and olive oil, and Athena's calm, deliberate movements as she sketches invisible lines in the air. Historians still argue whether these accounts reflect literal belief in her urban guidance or symbolic promotion of wisdom in civic planning, but the image is hypnotic. Her architectural genius isn't just about aesthetics. Fringe tales suggest she subtly dictates street widths, building orientations, and temple placements to optimize trade, defense, and daily life. You can imagine the tactile feel of sandstone under her fingertips, the gentle scrape of her staff as she draws lines, and the quiet hum of her thought process as she balances form and function. Scholars still debate whether these were practical guidelines projected onto myths or purely narrative embellishments, but the effect on your imagination is oddly grounding. Even minor details matter. Athena ensures proper drainage, sunlight exposure, and even acoustic effects in public spaces. Fringe accounts claim she once adjusted a marketplace layout so that traders' voices carried evenly across stalls, preventing disputes and enhancing commerce. You probably wouldn't survive analyzing each subtle adjustment, but imagining the faint hum of human activity flowing harmoniously through streets under her invisible hand is soothing, almost like listening to a soft river of life. Temples are particularly her domain. You picture her inspecting foundations, ensuring that sacred spaces align with both celestial patterns and social needs. Fringe myths suggest she might have whispered proportions to mortals in dreams, inspiring structures that were both beautiful and enduring. Historians still argue whether these architectural interventions were believed literally or simply symbolized her guidance and civic order, but the tactile, visual richness is comforting. Polished stone, sun-warmed marble, the faint scent of incense lingering in the air. Athena's city planning is not rigid. She encourages flexibility and clever adaptation. Fringe accounts suggest she sometimes rearranged paths, fountains, or olive groves overnight, prompting mortals to think creatively and solve problems independently. You probably won't survive cataloging every ingenious tweak fully awake, but the soft rhythm of adjustments, observation, and clever nudges resonates like a lullaby of foresight and patience. Her influence extends to the arts and infrastructure, too. You might picture her silently guiding artisans and engineers, ensuring bridges, aqueducts, and public squares serve both practical and aesthetic purposes. Fringe tales suggest she subtly intervened in building techniques, leaving hints of innovation for attentive observers. Scholars still debate whether these interventions were ritualistic, symbolic, or narrative exaggerations, but the imagery, the tactile heft of stones, the warm sunlight on bricks, the distant scent of fresh mortar, is soothing and immersive. Even civic rituals are under her gentle oversight. You can imagine Athena observing early festivals, subtly rearranging temple layouts or altar placements to optimize flow and participation. Fringe myths hint she sometimes left small tokens, olive branches, carved symbols, to indicate proper alignment, blending divinity with practical urban planning. You probably wouldn't survive considering every tiny calibration, but the rhythm of organization, observation, and thoughtful guidance is hypnotic. By the end of this section, Athena emerges as the ultimate architect of city life, a guardian of form, function, and wisdom. You might visualize her standing on a high terrace, looking over a city of perfect lines, olive groves swaying in the wind, sun glinting on white stone, her calm figure a quiet pulse beneath the bustle of human activity. The soft cadence of streets, structures, and ritual spaces under her influence mirrors your own slowing breath, guiding you gently toward the next story, where strategy, craft, and divine guidance continue to interweave in mesmerizing, dreamlike patterns. You trudge now into Athena's subtle involvement in law and justice, and it's oddly mesmerizing to picture her sitting quietly in a courtroom of marble, robe gently swaying, observing mortal judges and citizens as they fumble through the earliest forms of civic order. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but imagine the soft echo of sandals on stone, the faint tang of olive oil in the air, and Athena's calm, watchful eyes noting every argument, every hesitation, every clever twist of rhetoric. Historians still argue whether her guidance in law reflects actual cultic practice or a simply symbolic representation of wisdom over impulsive judgment. Her approach to justice is never heavy-handed. Fringe tales suggest she sometimes whispered clarifications or subtle hints to jurors or magistrates, pointing toward fairness without overtly influencing outcomes. You can almost feel the tactile contrast of smooth stone benches and rough parchment scrolls, and the quiet rhythm of deliberation under her invisible, guiding hand. Scholars still debate whether these interventions were literally believed or metaphorical, but the image is hypnotic in its calm, ordered logic. Athena favors reason over brute strength. You might picture her quietly observing disputes, subtly adjusting the order of arguments, or even suggesting clever methods of mediation. Fringe accounts suggest she sometimes planted symbolic olive leaves or carved owls in courthouse architecture as reminders of prudence and vigilance. You probably wouldn't survive tracking every minor visual cue, but the layered subtlety of these interventions has a lulling, almost ASMR-like effect, drawing your mind into a state of slow, contemplative rhythm. Even moral lessons are carefully woven. Athena emphasizes proportionality, foresight, and creative problem-solving in her guidance. Fringe myths suggest she sometimes disguised herself as a minor scribe or witness, offering indirect wisdom through testimony, allowing mortals to learn judgment through observation. Historians still argue whether such tales were intended as literal divine teaching or narrative devices to model civic intelligence, but imagining her subtle interventions adds texture to your sleepy, immersive visualization. Her justice also extends to symbolic reminders. You picture Athena placing small tokens, a cleverly angled olive branch, a carved symbol of an owl, to encourage fairness, honesty, and strategic thinking. Fringe accounts claim these tiny gestures often altered the flow of trials in meaningful ways without anyone realizing it. You probably won't survive analyzing each intervention fully awake, but the soft, rhythmic unfolding of justice under her watchful gaze is hypnotic and comforting. Athena's influence reaches beyond courts into broader civic ethics. You might imagine her subtly guiding leaders in matters of diplomacy, trade agreements, or city disputes, nudging them toward clever, ethical solutions. Fringe myths even hint she occasionally inspired creative resolutions that prevented unnecessary conflict. Scholars still debate whether these interventions reflect real societal values or narrative embellishments, but the interplay of strategy, ethics, and gentle oversight is soothing and methodical. Even the environment contributes to her lessons. You can picture sun-warmed marble floors, shadows dancing across olive groves visible through open columns, and the faint rustle of leaves acting as subtle cues for timing and rhythm in deliberation. Fringe tales suggest attentive mortals could read these cues as guidance from the goddess, a quiet form of observation that blends natural and divine instruction. Historians still argue whether such stories were meant to reflect real rituals or allegorical narratives, but either way, the imagery is rich and calming. By the end of this section, Athena emerges as a subtle architect of justice and ethics, a goddess who emphasizes foresight, observation, and strategic intervention without overtly controlling outcomes. You might visualize her serene figure standing on a terrace overlooking a city in early lawmaking, olive leaves brushing against stone columns, the sun low in the sky, her calm presence radiating through every action. The rhythmic pulse of thoughtful, measured justice mirrors your own slowing breath, drawing you further into a reflective, meditative state, ready for the next chapter where Athena's wisdom continues to guide mortals, heroes, and cities alike. You trudge now into Athena's subtle interventions in seafaring and navigation, and it's oddly calming to imagine her standing at the edge of a rocky shore, the wind tugging at her cloak, eyes tracing every ripple, every wave, every glint of sunlight on water. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but picture her noticing currents, shifts in the wind, and the faint shimmer of distant shoals, offering guidance to mortals who will later become legendary sailors. Historians still argue whether these maritime myths reflect literal divine patronage or symbolic encouragement of skill, caution, and cleverness in seafaring. Athena doesn't need dramatic gestures. Fringe accounts suggest she sometimes arranges clouds, bird flight patterns, or reflective waves to subtly indicate safe passages. You can almost hear the gentle slap of waves against the hull, smell salt in the air, and feel the faint sway of a small vessel, all under her quiet observation. Scholars still debate whether such interventions were believed literally or metaphorically, but the sensory imagery lulls your mind, the ebb and flow of water blending with your own breathing. Her guidance is practical as well as clever. Imagine her pointing, without moving a muscle, to safe harbor locations, optimal sailing routes, or currents that could speed or impede travel. Fringe myths claim she occasionally left small, symbolic markers, like carved owls on docks, to inspire attention and observation among attentive sailors. You probably wouldn't survive tracking every subtle hint, but the rhythm of tides and gentle nudges resonates like a soft, meditative cadence. Even dangerous encounters are opportunities for learning. Athena teaches heroes like Odysseus to anticipate hazards, avoid reckless choices, and rely on intellect over brute strength. Fringe accounts suggest she sometimes guided the trajectory of waves or the flight of birds to signal timing and direction, though historians still argue whether these tales reflect ritual beliefs or poetic storytelling. The imagery, the smell of wet wood, the sun glinting off water, the quiet rustle of sails, creates a soothing tapestry for your imagination. Athena's influence extends to the equipment and techniques of navigation. You might picture her silently overseeing the construction of ships, optimizing balance, sail design, and even rudder placement. Fringe tales suggest she whispered innovations into the minds of mortal craftsmen, giving rise to subtle technological advances. Scholars still debate whether these stories were meant literally or metaphorically, but the effect is hypnotic, a gentle layering of knowledge and foresight. Her mentorship often involves small, almost playful tests. You can imagine her nudging a boat slightly off course or signaling with a subtle reflection to encourage attentive observation and clever correction. Fringe myths even suggest that sailors who noticed the cues were rewarded with unusually smooth journeys, while inattentive crews learned patience the hard way. You probably won't survive analyzing each microadjustment, but the rhythmic flow of teaching through natural elements is calming and meditative. Even environmental elements are part of her strategy. You picture sunlight glinting off waves, wind carrying olive-scented breezes from distant groves, and the gentle rise and fall of water echoing her subtle guidance. Fringe accounts suggest that perceptive mortals could interpret these natural signs as Athena's quiet instruction, blending divine intervention with attentive observation. Historians still debate whether these narratives were actual practices or allegorical storytelling, but the imagery has a hypnotic quality. By the end of this section, Athena emerges as both mentor and guardian of seafaring, a goddess who emphasizes foresight, careful observation, and clever adaptation. You might visualize her figure atop a cliff, olive-scented wind brushing against your skin, soft waves rolling in the background, every motion measured and intentional. The slow cadence of water, wind, and subtle divine guidance mirrors your own steady breathing, pulling you gently into a contemplative, dreamlike state, ready for the next chapter of myth, craft, and subtle influence. You trudge now into Athena's quiet influence over agriculture and olive cultivation, and it's oddly soothing to picture her walking through groves of young olive trees, fingers brushing over silvery leaves, eyes scanning for disease, pests, or signs of healthy growth. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but imagine the soft rustle of leaves, the faint earthy scent of fertile soil, and the warm sunlight filtering through branches as she subtly directs the growth of an entire civilization's most vital crop. Historians still argue whether these myths reflect actual religious practices tied to olive cultivation or symbolic promotion of resource management and foresight. Her interventions are often almost imperceptible. Fringe accounts suggest Athena rearranged soil, nudged irrigation channels, or even whispered subtle instructions to attentive farmers in dreams. You can feel the tactile richness, the rough bark under her fingers, the smooth curves of olives forming, and the soft crunch of soil beneath your feet. Scholars still debate whether these tales were believed literally or served metaphorically as encouragement for prudent, clever agriculture. Athena's guidance extends to techniques as well as timing. Imagine her directing pruning practices, planting schedules, and even the spacing of trees to maximize sunlight and airflow. Fringe myths suggest she sometimes left symbolic markers, like small carvings in wood or stone, indicating optimal planting patterns. You probably wouldn't survive analyzing every agricultural nuance, but the repetitive, rhythmic imagery, pruning, planting, harvesting, is hypnotic and lulling. Even seasonal cycles are under her quiet supervision. Athena teaches mortals to observe the phases of the moon, rainfall patterns, and other environmental cues, blending clever observation with patience. Fringe tales claim she occasionally arranged subtle natural signs, like wind direction or bird flight, to hint at the right times for sowing or harvesting. Historians still argue whether these stories reflect actual ritualized guidance or poetic metaphor, but the layered sensory imagery is calming. Her influence blends practicality with foresight. You can imagine Athena advising farmers not only on olive trees, but also on companion crops, soil rotation, and even trade potential, ensuring communities thrive sustainably. Fringe myths even suggest she encouraged artistic representations of olives in pottery and textiles, subtly linking cultural identity to practical resources. You probably won't survive cataloging each practical and symbolic detail fully awake, but the slow, deliberate rhythms of planting, tending, and harvesting create a meditative cadence. Athena's protective role is evident in pest and disease management too. You might picture her silently guiding the placement of natural deterrents, suggesting companion plants, or signaling the timing of interventions. Fringe accounts even claim she occasionally infused minor rituals with gentle blessings to encourage plant health. Those scholars debate the literal versus symbolic significance. The sensory layering, scent of soil, soft hum of insects, dappled sunlight, forms a comforting backdrop. Even human behavior is part of her instruction. You picture Athena observing and subtly guiding cooperation among workers, teaching patience, foresight, and diligence, ensuring that both human and agricultural communities flourish together. Fringe myths suggest she sometimes left small tokens, an olive leaf or carved symbol, to remind farmers to work with observation and care. Scholars still debate the origin and intent of these stories, but the narrative rhythm is undeniably soothing. By the end of this section, Athena emerges as the quiet steward of agriculture, a goddess blending observation, foresight, and subtle instruction to cultivate both crops and community. You might visualize her figure moving slowly through sunlit groves, soft breeze rustling leaves, olives gleaming under gentle sunlight, every motion deliberate yet serene. The gentle cadence of growth, human effort, and divine guidance mirrors your own steady breathing, lulling you toward a meditative, dreamlike state, ready for the next chapter of wisdom, subtle influence, and clever guidance. You trudge now into Athena's influence over arts and crafts beyond the loom, and it's oddly mesmerizing to picture her moving through workshops, soft sunlight catching on bronze, clay, and carved wood, fingers tracing the smooth curves of objects as if testing their intelligence. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but imagine the faint smell of wet clay, the subtle gleam of polished bronze, and the quiet hum of artisans, all under her gentle, invisible guidance. Historians still argue whether these myths reflect actual religious devotion to craftsmanship or symbolic promotion of intelligence and skill. Her guidance is never overt. Fringe tales suggest she nudges mortal hands with subtle gestures, an imperceptible tilt of a tool, a shadow that indicates the proper angle, or a soft breeze aligning fine threads or patterns. You can almost feel the tactile sensation of chisels, hammers, and brushes, combined with the faint metallic scent of copper and the warm glow of kiln fires. Scholars still debate whether these interventions were literally believed or served metaphorically to inspire ingenuity, but the effect on your imagination is hypnotic. Athena's mentorship often blends functionality with beauty. You might picture her adjusting proportions in pottery, suggesting clever balance in sculptures, or hinting at subtle decorative motifs that carry meaning, like olives or owls. Fringe accounts claim she sometimes whispers miniature design secrets in dreams, guiding mortals toward enduring creations. You probably wouldn't survive mentally cataloging every nuanced intervention, but the repetitive rhythm of shaping, observing, and adjusting is soothing, almost like a lullaby of craftsmanship. Even mistakes are instructive. Athena encourages experimentation, allowing artisans to explore and correct errors with gentle guidance. Fringe myths suggest she occasionally rearranged workshop items overnight, prompting mortals to problem-solve creatively. Historians still argue whether these narratives were intended as ritual guidance or storytelling embellishments, but the imagery of focused hands, warm kilns, and soft sunlight has a calming, meditative effect. Her influence extends to metalwork and weaponry as well. You can imagine her inspecting bronze armor or finely wrought weapons, subtly adjusting angles or edges to improve efficiency and aesthetic appeal. Fringe accounts even suggest she occasionally infused these objects with symbolic blessings, embedding wisdom and strategy into tangible tools. You probably won't survive cataloging each precise tweak fully awake, but the soft rhythm of repeated refinement and observation carries a hypnotic cadence. Athena's presence is both encouraging and playful. You picture her gliding through the workshop, a sly smile on her lips, nudging a hammer here, a brush there, leaving small, almost imperceptible marks for observant artisans to notice. Fringe tales claim this subtle mischief enhances attention to detail, teaching patience and mindfulness in an enjoyable way. Scholars still debate whether these stories are literal or metaphorical, but imagining her quiet amusement adds a soothing, human-like texture to divine guidance. Even cultural continuity is part of her teaching. You might imagine Athena subtly linking motifs in art to broader civic or spiritual lessons, ensuring that beauty carries intelligence and meaning, not just decoration. Fringe myths suggest she sometimes orchestrated collaborations among artists, inspiring innovation and cross-pollination of ideas. Historians still argue whether such accounts reflect historical collaboration or narrative invention, but the layered imagery, the scent of wet clay, glint of polished bronze, soft sunlight on a workshop floor, is hypnotic. By the end of this section, Athena emerges as the ultimate patron of arts and crafts, a goddess blending guidance, subtle intervention, and playful instruction, fostering intelligence, creativity, and endurance in mortal artisans. You might visualize her figure moving slowly among sculptors and smiths, soft olive-scented breeze brushing your skin, sunlight glinting off polished surfaces, her calm presence guiding every motion. The gentle cadence of crafting, observation, and divine insight mirrors your own steady, meditative breath, drawing you deeper into a reflective, dreamlike state, ready for the next chapter of clever influence, strategy, and subtle guidance. You trudge now into Athena's complex role in diplomacy and political council, and it's oddly calming to picture her moving through crowded council chambers, olive-scented breeze brushing against her bronze armor, eyes flicking from speaker to speaker with serene focus. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but imagine the rustle of togas, the soft tap of sandaled feet on stone floors, and the faint murmur of debate, all under her subtle, watchful presence. Historians still argue whether myths about her political interventions reflect actual influence on civic life or are symbolic narratives emphasizing wisdom and strategy over force. Athena's guidance is quiet but precise. Fringe tales suggest she subtly adjusts seating arrangements, the placement of scrolls, or even the direction of sunlight streaming through windows to emphasize points, nudge attention, or encourage reflection. You can almost feel the tactile weight of clay amphory lining walls, the polished sheen of marble benches, and the rhythmic cadence of dialogue as her invisible hand guides proceedings. Scholars still debate whether these interventions were literally believed or primarily narrative devices promoting strategic thinking. Her mentorship favors clever negotiation and forethought. You might picture her softly suggesting compromise, highlighting flaws in arguments, or inspiring creative proposals that balance competing interests. Fringe accounts suggest she occasionally orchestrates coincidences in timing, a delayed messenger, a sudden breeze carrying scents or sounds to provide subtle cues. You probably wouldn't survive parsing each cue fully awake, but the rhythm of discussion, adjustment, and insight has a hypnotic, meditative quality. Even minor gestures matter. Athena's subtle signals, a tilted head, a quiet nod, or a symbolic olive branch, can guide leaders toward wisdom without anyone realizing the source. Fringe myths claim attentive mortals could sense her presence and adjust behavior accordingly, learning lessons in patience, observation, and strategy. Historians still argue whether these accounts were intended literally or allegorically, but the layered sensory experience, soft murmurs, shifting light, gentle air currents, is calming. Athena also balances diplomacy with moral oversight. You can imagine her nudging decisions toward fairness, equity, and long-term stability, while discouraging rash actions or exploitation. Fringe accounts suggest she sometimes whispered ideas in dreams to influential figures, guiding negotiations indirectly. Scholars still debate whether such narratives reflect ritualized practices or literary embellishments, but the imagery of her quiet, calculated interventions is hypnotic. Her presence encourages reflection and mindfulness. You might picture council members pausing to notice a glint of sunlight, the scent of olive oil, or the soft hum of a breeze, each moment subtly directing attention to clarity and insight. Fringe tales even suggest Athena's interventions created moments of serendipity, an overheard comment, a timely question, shaping outcomes through careful observation. You probably won't survive cataloging every micro-adjustment fully awake, but the gentle, measured flow of guidance is comforting. Even conflict resolution carries her signature touch. You can imagine her subtly redirecting heated debates into constructive problem-solving, emphasizing intellect and strategy over anger or aggression. Fringe myths hint that she occasionally inspired symbolic gestures, olive leaves exchanged, carefully placed tokens, to signal compromise and wisdom. Historians still argue whether these tales were ritualized practices or narrative flourishes, but the imagery, the rustle of robes, soft light, whispered counsel, lulls your imagination into a serene cadence. By the end of this section, Athena emerges as the ultimate strategist of diplomacy, a goddess blending foresight, subtle intervention, and gentle guidance to shape civic life without imposing force. You might visualize her figure standing quietly at a chamber's entrance, sun catching her armor, olive breeze brushing your skin, every subtle action measured and deliberate. The soft rhythm of discussion, observation, and strategic nudges mirrors your own slowing breath, drawing you into a meditative, dreamlike state, ready for the final chapter, where Athena's wisdom continues to influence mortals, cities, and heroes alike. You trudge now into Athena's influence over festivals and ritual celebrations, and it's oddly soothing to imagine her moving through open-air gatherings, sunlight bouncing off togas and temple columns, her calm presence weaving through the murmur of music, laughter, and incense smoke. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but picture the faint tang of burning herbs, the rhythmic beat of drums, and the soft rustle of olive branches, all under her subtle, watchful guidance. Historians still argue whether myths about her role in festivals reflect actual religious practice or symbolic reinforcement of civic cohesion and wisdom. Her interventions are gentle and almost imperceptible. Fringe tales suggest she arranges ceremonial elements to maximize aesthetic and symbolic effect. The precise placement of altars, timing of dances with the sun's position, or alignment of offerings to cast specific shadows. You can almost feel the smooth marble of temple steps underfoot, the tactile brush of fabric in dancers' hands, and the quiet rhythm of collective movement, guided by her unseen hand. Scholars still debate whether these descriptions were meant as literal divine intervention or literary metaphor, but the imagery is mesmerizing. Athena emphasizes order, strategy, and mindfulness even in celebration. You might picture her signaling timing for processions, subtly nudging leaders to encourage generosity, or ensuring games and contests flow smoothly. Fringe myths suggest she sometimes whispers clues or guidance in dreams to organizers, shaping events without their conscious awareness. You probably wouldn't survive tracking every subtle adjustment fully awake, but the steady cadence of preparation, execution, and celebration is calming, almost meditative. Even minor rituals carry layers of meaning under her watch. Athena's touch might be a glint of sunlight reflecting off an offering, the rustle of an olive branch in a ceremonial procession, or the placement of ceremonial tools that prompt observation and thought. Fringe accounts claim that careful attention to these details rewarded mortals with insight, creativity, or harmonious outcomes. Historians still argue whether these interventions were believed literally or were narrative embellishments promoting attentiveness and cleverness. Her guidance extends to arts within festivals, too. You can imagine her overseeing music, dance, and dramatic recitations, subtly encouraging innovation, skill, and precision. Fringe tales even suggest she sometimes inspired performers with sudden bursts of inspiration, like rhythmic patterns, melodic ideas, or symbolic gestures that deepen the meaning of a celebration. You probably won't survive cataloging every nuanced artistic intervention, but the imagery, the scent of herbs, soft sunlight, rhythmic drums, is soothing. Athena also ensures fairness and cleverness in competitions. You might picture her subtly balancing chances, encouraging merit over luck or strength alone, guiding mortals toward creative solutions and strategy. Fringe myths claim she sometimes planted visual cues, small carvings, symbolic objects, or light patterns to signal clever tactics. Scholars still debate whether these accounts reflect ritual practice or narrative flair, but the sensory layering of her interventions is hypnotic. Even communal harmony is under her subtle watch. Athena nudges interactions toward cooperation, patience, and understanding, emphasizing intellect over conflict. Fringe tales suggest she sometimes orchestrates serendipitous encounters, inspiring friendships or alliances that strengthen civic cohesion. You probably won't survive cataloging each subtle interaction, but the cadence of soft laughter, music, and movement under her influence has a lulling, almost ASMR-like quality. By the end of this section, Athena emerges as the guiding hand of ritual, festival, and communal celebration, a goddess blending foresight, subtle intervention, and quiet wisdom to shape experiences that entertain, instruct, and inspire. You might visualize her figure gliding through columns and dancers, sun glinting off armor, olive-scented breeze brushing your skin, her serene presence quietly orchestrating joy, skill, and insight. The rhythmic pulse of music, movement, and subtle guidance mirrors your own breathing, preparing you for the final chapter where her influence culminates across myth, heroism, and daily life. You trudge now into Athena's final, overarching influence, and it's oddly mesmerizing to picture her standing atop a hill, gazing over Athens and the wider Greek world, cloak fluttering in a soft wind, olive-scented and sun-warmed, eyes flicking across the patchwork of cities, fields, seas, and heroes. You probably won't survive this fully awake, but imagine the distant hum of activity, markets, workshops, ships, and courts, all subtly guided by her watchful presence. Historians still argue whether these overarching myths reflect real civic and religious reverence or symbolic storytelling emphasizing intelligence, foresight, and order. Athena's influence is cumulative. Fringe tales suggest she weaves her guidance like threads in an invisible tapestry, nudging heroes, mortals, and cities toward cleverness, resilience, and cooperative success. You can almost feel the rhythm of her interventions, a slight breeze, a glint of sunlight, an olive leaf trembling in the wind, all cues for careful observation and thoughtful action. Scholars still debate whether this tapestry was literally conceptualized in rituals or entirely a narrative device, but the layered sensory imagery is hypnotic, a slow, steady pulse that matches your own breathing. Her mentorship spans every domain you've witnessed: warfare, diplomacy, seafaring, agriculture, law, arts, festivals. Fringe myths even suggest she sometimes appears in dreams or quiet moments, offering subtle insight, encouragement, or playful correction. You probably wouldn't survive cataloging each micro-intervention fully awake, but the cadence of her omnipresent, measured influence has a soft, lulling quality, almost like a gentle heartbeat beneath the world's chaos. Athena balances guidance with freedom. You might picture her letting heroes stumble briefly, allowing cities to test their structures, or leaving minor errors in festivals or battles as opportunities for learning. Fringe accounts claim that attentive mortals could perceive her invisible nudges, responding with ingenuity, cleverness, and insight. Historians still argue whether these nuances were meant literally, ritually, or as narrative embellishment, but the rhythm is undeniably soothing, a gentle ebb and flow of instruction and autonomy. Even subtle sensory cues carry meaning. You can imagine her presence reflected in soft glints on bronze, the rustle of olive leaves, rhythmic water currents, or distant drumbeats, moments that quietly shape awareness and thought. Fringe tales suggest that those who notice these signals gain enhanced insight and timing, while scholars debate whether such motifs were ritualized or literary devices. Either way, your imagination absorbs the layers of sight, sound, touch, and scent, each gently guiding you toward relaxation. Her humor and playfulness also permeate these stories. Athena might allow minor chaos for observation, a fleeting test of cleverness, or a sly wink at human ingenuity. You probably won't survive cataloging every instance, but the lightness softens the weight of her wisdom, making her presence calming rather than oppressive. By the end, Athena emerges as the ultimate embodiment of intelligence, strategy, and subtle guidance. You might visualize her standing silently on a hill, olive-scented breeze rustling the leaves, sunlight glinting softly off her bronze armor, cities and heroes below moving with quiet rhythm under her watch. The slow, deliberate cadence of her influence mirrors your own steady breathing, pulling your mind deeper into reflection and sleep, ready for dreams filled with cleverness, calm, and gentle guidance.